Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interviews with prominent authors and historians talking about smallpox epidemics during colonial times. My name is Randy Flood, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Christian Despigna, author of The Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. So why don't we get started? Christian, why don't you invite our guest and introduce him?
Andrew, we're real excited you could be with us today. Just a brief background, Andrew Wehrman is an historian of early American history and the history of American medicine at Central Michigan University. He received his PhD in U.S. colonial history from Northwestern University. His research focuses on the intersections between politics and medicine in colonial and revolutionary America. He received the Walter Muir Whitehill Award for his article in New England Quarterly, The Siege of Castlepox, A Medical Revolution in Marblehead, Massachusetts, 1764 to 1777. His current book, The Contagion of Liberty, The Politics of Smallpox and the American Revolution, argues that popular demand for public inoculation during smallpox epidemics in the 1760s and 1770s infected revolutionary politics and changed the way Americans understood their health and their government's responsibility to protect it. Andrew, thank you for being with us today.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. Well, let's launch right into these questions then we have for you. Now, on the average, smallpox spread throughout the Boston area about every decade or so during the 18th century. So let's focus on the 1764 epidemic in Boston in particular, where Dr. Joseph Warren played such a pivotal role. How did that epidemic begin, and what efforts were really made to mitigate the disease?
Okay, yeah. I'm a historian, so I have to go back a little bit, but my book will talk about each of those 18th century epidemics in Boston and elsewhere. So you might be familiar with the 1721 epidemic. That was the first time inoculation for smallpox was used in America, and that was when Cotton Mather's African slave Onesimus introduced the technique of inoculation, giving inserting a bit of a smallpox pustule, the matter into the skin, and it gives you a mild case of smallpox rather than the really nasty natural version that you breathe in through your lungs. And that was very controversial in 1721. Cotton Mather had a bomb thrown in his house. That thankfully didn't go off, but people were angry. This was playing God. This wasn't good science. Well, that cooled off over the coming decades. People recognized how useful inoculation was, but it was still dangerous. When you inoculated someone, they got a mild case of smallpox, but they were still infectious. So you had to isolate and quarantine anyone who was inoculated for 3 weeks so they wouldn't start an epidemic. That meant people could get inoculated. If you lived in a farmhouse, you could have your family inoculated out in the country and you wouldn't infect anyone. You just had to stay isolated for 3 weeks. Now that sounds easy, to just stay in for 3 weeks. We're used to that. But if you were in a big city, a tight city like Boston, if you were to inoculate, your neighbors could get infected and you could start an epidemic. So nobody wanted it. So inoculation was a last resort in an urban area like Boston, but everyone recognized how effective it was. So in 1752, during an epidemic, thousands of Bostonians inoculated. About 2,000 decided to do it. It was a stunning success. Then about a decade passes without another epidemic. Bostonians got really good at defending themselves against disease. They had a good public health system. The selectmen of Boston, kind of the city council, would inspect ships coming into port. They knew if a ship was coming in from a place where the smallpox had broken out, that they would check the sailors. They would isolate sailors on Rainsford Island, where they had a quarantine hospital. And that worked pretty well. If anybody got sick in the city, they would take them to the isolation hospital. Well, in December 1763, a ship came in from Nova Scotia, and a sailor died of smallpox on board the ship. And the selectmen of Boston isolated the sailors, asked the sailors, anyone who hadn't had smallpox yet had to be quarantined. And one sailor somehow slipped through. Maybe he already expected that he had had smallpox before and didn't think he was infectious. But he went home to his father's house on Fish Street in Boston. His name was Joseph Bulkley. And a few days later, sure enough, Bulkley got sick and had a really severe case of smallpox. And within a few days, he died. So this is on Fish Street, the north end of Boston, near the Old North Church. And there were strict rules for this. So when there was someone infectious in Boston, if they were too sick to be taken to a quarantine hospital, they would put a fence, or they would build a fence around the person's house. They would mark it with a red flag, so no one was allowed to enter. They would put a guard out front to keep people from going in and out of the house. When Bulkley died, they had strict rules. The body had to be removed from the house after midnight. It had to be wrapped in a tarred sheet, put in a coffin, and taken out to the North End burying ground to be buried. All of his clothes and bedding were burned, and that usually worked. That usually prevented it from spreading. But about a week after Bulkley died, there were more cases of smallpox along Fish Street, and the selectmen struggled to contain them. The selectmen reported the number of cases every day to the newspapers, so the newspapers printed where the infection was, how many cases there were. And the rule in Boston was that if 20 households got infected, the city would declare it an epidemic and would allow all the people of Boston to inoculate if they wanted to. It had gotten out of control. We can't contain it. So go ahead and inoculate.
You know, and that leads me to the next question, because really, then as now, opposing views on how to control the spread of disease were part of the public debate. And in 1764, a lot of people felt that the selectmen waited too long before allowing people to be legally inoculated. Yet ultimately, you argue the largest general inoculation occurred during the 1764 smallpox epidemic, to that point in America and in Europe. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the number of cases was growing. The selectmen in January, February 1764 still thought they had it under control. All the cases were on this one street, Fish Street, and they said, yeah, there are a lot of houses on Fish Street that are getting infected, but it's just this one street. We can contain it. They wanted to raise the threshold to 30 houses infected instead of 20. And that was controversial. As it creeped up into the teens, people started saying, look, we need to inoculate. We're all going to get sick. This is going to get broken out. And you'd rather, your chances of dying were so high if you caught it naturally than if you went ahead and inoculated. And that's where the pressure was. A group of wealthy Bostonians anonymously sent a letter to an inoculator in New Jersey named William Barnett and said, can you come to Boston and inoculate us? The sheriff Greenleaf in Boston, got a hold of that letter, took it to the Governor Bernard, Francis Bernard, and said, look, these people are trying to inoculate illegally. And Francis Bernard looked at the letter and said, you know, inviting an inoculator here is a really good idea. I don't think these selectmen are going to be able to control it. And he endorsed their letter, sent a separate letter to Barnett, and said, come on to Boston. There's no way we're going to keep this under control. So yeah, there was debate over it. Everyone thought inoculation would work. It was just a debate over when and how to do it.
Right. You know, and this brings us to another interesting little gem that you've researched. And we know that in 1764, strict quarantines were implemented in Boston for those who were infected. Talk to us about Paul Revere's experience with the 1764 smallpox scourge.
Well, Paul Revere lived on Fish Street at that time. This was before he moved to the Paul Revere house that we know today on the Freedom Trail And so, yeah, if you were on Fish Street, people were getting sick. They were having fences built around their houses. The city was hiring guards to make sure that nobody went in or out of these places. On February 6, 1764, Paul Revere reports to the selectmen that one of his children has come down with smallpox. It was required if someone was sick in your house, you had to report it.
Right.
And so I think this was a child, a 6 or 7 year old of Revere's. Revere family wasn't willing to have his kid sent to the quarantine hospital by himself, and so says, okay, go ahead and fence off my house. And so he does it. And there's a guard placed outside the Revere house, and the instructions are that no one's supposed to go in and out of these houses. And some of the guards, and I have this in my chapter, but were kind of sleeping on the job. They weren't being well trusted, and so people in the neighborhood were watching each other's houses to make sure everyone was following the rules of quarantine. So there's an irony here that Paul Revere, who watches British soldiers in 1775 to keep track of their movements, is now being watched by his neighbor.
Right.
And sure enough, Revere goes in and out of his house, and his neighbors report him to the selectmen. How could you not? Your kid. You want to go check on him. But he goes in, and the selectmen, he and another guy who does the same thing, get called in, and they get a warning. They're not supposed to go into their house. He's not arrested, but they say, this is serious. You have to. Revere's wife, I'm sure, was in the house, but he had to stay outside of it if he was going to go in and out. So he was not allowed to go back into his own house at that point.
Right. And this was serious because you could be imposed with a serious fine. And I've read actually articles from that time in newspapers saying you were subject to a fine, or you could even be flogged if you did not follow those quarantines.
Mm-hmm.
If you were found to be they would say wickedly or wantonly spreading smallpox. So if you were knowingly or unknowingly spreading it, if you didn't turn in information, it was serious, or you could get fined for doing what Revere tried to do.
Right.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering when they look and they learn about the epidemic of 1764. How did that epidemic in Boston in particular affect the American Revolution as a whole, and particularly the decision of George Washington to inoculate the entire Continental Army in 1777? So
this takes about, 250 pages in my book to get through it all, but I'll keep it short. So eventually, they in the selectmen in Boston can't control it. They're trying to keep it in, but on March 5th. It gets into enough households in different parts of the city, and the selectmen say we're not going to be able to contain it, and they announce that a general inoculation can take place. Everybody in Boston who wants to can inoculate. Anybody who doesn't needs to leave before that happens. So they announce this general inoculation. And this time in Boston, the 64 epidemic's different than the previous ones. In the previous ones, they noticed that poor people died in the epidemic. They couldn't afford to get inoculated. They couldn't pay doctors' prices, and they also couldn't afford to leave, to flee the city. They didn't have places to go. And so in 1764, the city made a really conscious effort to provide for the poor. So this is where Joseph Warren comes in. So Warren was one of 27 doctors in Boston, and some come from outside Boston, to agree to treat poor patients for free during the epidemic. And the city agreed to reimburse them a certain amount for each patient that they inoculate. So Joseph Warren's inoculating people on Castle Island with John Jeffries and some other doctors are there. Doctors are around the town. So that they're agreeing to do that. The selectmen are paying for guards, they're paying for doctors, they're paying for nurses, they're paying for bedding. They're paying bakers to keep bread prices low for the sick in Boston. It's an extraordinary expense that happens, and over 1,000 poor Bostonians take advantage and get inoculated. 5,000 people total are inoculated in Boston, which is the largest number of people inoculated at one time in Europe or America at that time. And it's a stunning success. 5,000 are inoculated. Only 46 of those patients die, less than 1%. And that becomes a real model. Bostonians cheer this news. They're really excited about it after the epidemic ends in June. They give full confidence to the selectmen for the job that they did. They have an incredible confidence in their local government. The effort of their local leaders to tackle a disease like this and to be a model for others to take care of the poor is just a huge rallying cry. At the same time, in the spring of 1764, Boston learns that Parliament is going to start taxing them. They're going to start changing the tax structure that has existed. This is after the French and Indian War. So in April of 1764, Boston learns of the Sugar Act. And imagine if some distant government, after the wreckage of an epidemic, we're experiencing one now, the poor economy, the jobs lost, the expenses, that some distant government is going to change the customs laws. You're going to end up paying more money. Merchants are going to be taxed. They're making these arguments. James Otis is arguing about taxation without representation. At the same time, Bostonians are trying to figure out how they're going to pay for the epidemic. And a few historians have commented on how the epidemic of 64 affected those protests and riots of 64 and 65. So I do that in the book. Also, Boston, because of how it took care of the 64 epidemic, becomes a model for other communities. Other people and other towns start demanding general inoculations in the same way. Poor people expect their governments to do the same thing for them, as happened in Boston. There are rallying cries for that. And in the revolution itself, when soldiers are going off to war and smallpox is breaking out again, New England soldiers especially are expecting their government or their military leaders or General Washington to provide inoculation for them. They understand that it works. They understand that it can be done in mass numbers. And eventually Washington gives in and agrees with them and organizes an even larger effort to inoculate the Continental Army.
Mm-hmm. Now, did he do that after Valley Forge as well? I mean, when these winners arose in the encampments in Morristown and Middlebrook and these other locations, did he continue to focus on inoculations?
It happened really swiftly in the winter and spring of 1777. But yeah, he would continue. All new recruits would be inoculated when they joined, and they would routinely ask after that initial huge inoculation. They would make sure that soldiers who were joining up had been inoculated. So yeah, they inoculated at Morristown and Valley Forge.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, Andrew, that's about all the time we have now. And so thank you very much for your insights and analysis. It's been really, really educational and certainly more than worthwhile. So I thank you for being here, and thank you, Christian, once again. And folks, I hope you join us for another Zoom interview sponsored by the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society in the future. So long for now.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks so much.